Is it possible for a civilization to leave behind thousands of words and still lose the one sentence that matters most? In the dim borderland between sleep and scholarship, there's a peculiar feeling, not of discovery, but of absence. A page seems torn out before anyone could read it. A name is spoken with confidence, yet the first breath of that name is missing. The Anunnaki, those princely offspring of the oldest Mesopotamian poems, stand in the record like a doorway with no visible hinges. Their traces are not carved in marble. They arrive on clay, pressed by reed styluses into wedges and angles, then baked by accident or by fire. They lie in the long shadow of the Tigris and Euphrates, in city names that sound like hushed syllables: Nippur, Uruk, Eridu. The question that returns is not the one shouted by modern headlines. It is smaller, colder, and more difficult to hold. Where, in the earliest layers of writing, do the Anunnaki truly begin? In Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the Anunnaki are not introduced with a neat definition. Their name shifts in spelling and usage. In some contexts, they appear as a collective of powerful deities associated with judgment and the world below. In others, they are simply the divine assembly, the group that matters when decisions are made. Scholars map these appearances by comparing copies from different cities and centuries. The work is slow, careful, and full of margins. Yet, even in that carefulness, a gap persists. The genealogies of the gods are offered, but behind the genealogies there is fog. Sumerian tradition speaks of An, the sky, and Kai, the earth, and of the separation that made room for the world. It names Enlil, lord of wind and command, and Enki, lord of watery depths and clever counsel. It speaks of Ninhursag, motherly and severe, and of Inanna, restless and bright. When the Anunnaki appear, they are often placed as offspring of An, or as a venerable council. That phrasing can feel like an origin. But offspring is a word with a long shadow. Offspring of what union, in what moment, under what necessity? The myths sometimes answer, but not in a single, unbroken thread. Accounts conflict. The record grows quiet at the precise point where certainty would begin. Later, Akkadian compositions, copied and recopied across centuries, offer broader cosmic frames. The Babylonian creation epic, commonly called by its opening words, begins before names were fixed, when waters mingled and boundaries had not yet hardened. Gods emerge in generations, and lineage becomes a mechanism of power. In that narrative, the Anunnaki are present, but they are not the prime movers. They can be a political body that grants authority, or an audience that witnesses a struggle for kingship. The text is more interested in who rules than in who first made the ruling class. The question of creation slides into questions of precedence. At this point, the investigation starts to feel like a corridor that changes length as it is walked. The evidence is scattered: tablets from temple libraries, school exercises, hymns, laments, and ritual instructions. Some survive as near complete compositions. Others are only a handful of lines, broken at the edges, their beginnings and endings gone. A name like Anunnaki can appear in one fragment, then vanish, then return in a later copy that is itself a reworking of something older. The surviving record is thick with repetition, but thin where origins should be. Modern access to these texts came through excavation and collecting, and neither process preserved everything it touched. In the 19th century, large groups of tablets were recovered from the ruins of Nineveh and other sites, then transported to museums where they were cleaned, numbered, and slowly read. But tablets were often found broken and mixed, without a clear original order. Reconstruction became an art of patience, joining fragments, comparing parallel lines, deciding which gaps can be filled and which must remain blank. When a narrative is rebuilt from pieces, its missing lines become part of its meaning. The Anunnaki, in this sense, live inside the reconstruction. They exist where the text is legible and where scholars agree on how to read it. But the title question presses on the limits of what the tablets were trying to do. Mesopotamian religion did not always treat gods as created in the way later frameworks might expect. Some gods are personified forces, others are born from cosmic entities, others rise through divine politics, winning place by combat, decree, or marriage. Sometimes a god's origin is told differently in different cities, not as a single contradiction, but as local emphasis. When later scribes copied older material, they sometimes adjusted names and roles to fit the theology of their own time. What appears as one fixed group can be a layered tradition. Even the word itself is not a settled anchor. The Sumerian form is often explained as offspring of An, and some analyses suggest a sense like princely seed, but the etymology is debated. That matters because the name may already contain an answer: descent from the sky god. Yet if the name's components are less firm than they appear, then the origin story is less straightforward. It becomes a problem of language as much as of myth. There's another silence behind all of this: the silence of what has not been found, or not yet read, or not securely placed in context. Clay can survive for millennia, but survival depends on chance. Archives were lost to water, to reuse, to the slow grinding of time. A tablet in a museum may be legible, but its original room, its neighboring texts, the sequence of shelves, those relationships are gone. The missing relationships are missing meanings. So the investigation begins not with an answer, but with a map of absences. The Anunnaki are there, in inkless wedges, yet their first doorway remains half-bricked. The sources speak of their authority, their assembly, their judgments. They gesture back toward On, and toward earlier waters and darkness. But when the question turns and asks who made the makers, the clay grows quiet. Somewhere in that quiet, a broken line waits, its beginning lost, its end still clinging to the tablet's edge, suggesting that the next fragment, if it can be found and joined, might change the shape of the corridor. The name appears first like a shadow cast by something outside the frame. In transliteration, it looks stable, almost confident. Anunna or Anunna K4, sometimes with small shifts that seem minor until they are not. The wedges on clay do not sound. They only suggest sound. Between sign and voice, there is room for doubt, and doubt is where the question begins to breathe. Many modern explanations circle the same point. Anunnaki as offspring of An, a phrase that feels like a key. Yet the key does not always fit cleanly. Sumerian writing is not a simple alphabet. Signs can carry multiple readings. A single cluster can lean one way in one context and another way elsewhere. Scholars compare how the signs behave across hundreds of texts: administrative records, hymns, myths, school tablets, trying to hear the most likely word beneath the wedges. Even then, certainty comes in degrees. Some researchers accept the common derivation, others treat it with caution, noting how easily an appealing etymology can harden into assumed fact. If the name does mean seed or offspring, it points toward An, the sky god, a figure whose own origin is rarely framed like a human birth. An is often presented as a primordial presence, sky itself, the high vault, authority that is more like a condition than a person. In some traditions, An's spouse is Kai, earth, though the relationship is not consistent across all sources, and older and later texts do not always align. The genealogies do not behave like a single family record. They resemble overlapping maps drawn by different hands. There is a deeper complication. The Anunnaki are not always kept in the same place. Sometimes they seem to belong to heaven, close to An's sphere. Sometimes they are spoken of as deities of the underworld, a dread assembly beneath the earth. In certain texts, especially those involving the descent of Inanna or the laws of the netherworld, a group of gods appears as judges, as officials of a realm where return is difficult. These gods can be called Anunnaki, or closely related terms, depending on the text and the scholarly reading. Elsewhere, another group, the Igigi, is associated with heaven in Akkadian tradition, sometimes contrasted with the Anunnaki. But the lines between groups blur. In the drift of centuries, names can trade places or collapse into one another, or be used differently by different scribal schools. The investigation grows quiet here because it touches the edge of what can be proven from surviving material. The clay tablets do not offer a single master glossary. Meaning must be triangulated from context, from parallel passages, from bilingual lexical lists compiled by scribes learning Sumerian and Akkadian. Those lists are invaluable, yet they also reveal how later scholars of the ancient world, scribes themselves, were interpreting earlier language. A lexical list can preserve a tradition, but it can also fossilize an interpretation that was once flexible. When a modern reader asks, "Who created the Anunnaki?" the question assumes a beginning, an act, a moment when the group comes into being. But the Mesopotamian sources often describe divine order as layered rather than manufactured. Gods can be born, but they can also be appointed. They can emerge from cosmic substances. They can be named into prominence through ritual and kingship. A council of gods might not have been created so much as recognized, gathered, counted, invoked. The record preserves how people spoke to them and about them, not necessarily how the gods came to exist. Still, the name keeps pulling the mind toward ancestry. If they are offspring of An, why is there so little about their first appearance? Why do they not arrive with a clear scene, a clear birth, a clear dividing line between before and after? One possibility is that the story existed and is now lost. Another is that there was never one story. City-states did not share a single centralized scripture. Nippur, devoted to Enlil, had its own theological gravity. Eridu, associated with Enki, shaped myths differently. Uruk, with Inanna at its heart, emphasized other dramas. The Anunnaki could be a term that traveled among these centers, picking up meanings like dust on sandals. Some scholars point out that Anunnaki may function more like a category than a fixed roster. At times it can mean the great gods, or the gods of the earth, or the assembly with authority. In that case, the question, who created them, becomes harder, because categories are not born in the same way characters are. A category forms by use. It emerges when a language community needs a word for a set. The set may be imagined differently depending on ritual needs. A lament might call upon the Anunnaki as witnesses to suffering. A hymn might place them as supporters of a temple's patron god. A myth might cast them as an audience to cosmic decisions. In each case, the term does work, and the work shapes the term. Yet the mystery does not dissolve into mere semantics. Even if the Anunnaki are a category, the category rests on an implied hierarchy. It suggests a top tier, an inner circle. And hierarchies invite origin questions. How did this inner circle become inner? When did it become speakable? The oldest written texts from Mesopotamia are administrative, concerned with rations, labor, and goods. The gods hover at the margins, names and offerings, divine ownership of fields, temple economies. The full mythic voices arrive later in the surviving record, and they arrive already mature, already crowded with tradition. Here the corridor narrows into scribal practice. Sumerian literary texts were copied for centuries, often long after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language. That means many of the tablets modern scholars read are not originals, but later copies. A copy can preserve an older composition with remarkable fidelity. It can also smooth roughness, adjust unfamiliar phrases, align the divine cast with later expectations. A term like Anunnaki might appear more often in certain periods because scribes favored it, not because it was newly invented. Or it might appear earlier than surviving tablets indicate, because earlier occurrences have not survived. The clay itself becomes an accomplice in uncertainty. Broken edges swallow beginnings. Fire bakes and preserves, but also shatters. Water softens and erases. Excavation recovers what chance allows. Museums hold what was carried away. Between the ancient scribe and the modern reader lies a chain of accidents, each one capable of turning a clear lineage into a rumor. And still the name remains, a small cluster of signs that feels like a promise. Of An, it seems to whisper, and therefore of the sky. But if An is not described as created, then offspring of An may not answer the deeper hunger. It may only push the question upward into a higher silence. If An is sky and sky is a condition, then what does it mean to be born from a condition? The sources thin out here, and what remains is the sense that the next step must move away from the name itself and toward the places that used it, toward cities, temples, and the shifting maps of divine authority that made certain groups of gods feel inevitable. In the oldest cities of southern Mesopotamia, divinity was not only believed, it was housed. It had walls, courtyards, thresholds polished by feet, and storerooms heavy with grain. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were landlords of fields, recipients of beer and bread, names spoken at the start of transactions. In such a world, a divine council was not a philosophical idea. It was a political echo of the city itself. Nippur sat inland, not the largest city, yet it held a gravity that reached far beyond its canals. Its temple precinct, the Ekur, belonged to Enlil. In many traditions, Enlil is the one who separates heaven and earth, who orders winds, who grants kingship. When later dynasties sought legitimacy, they turned toward Nippur, toward Enlil's sanction. In the background of that sanction stands an assembly, the great gods who affirm decrees. Sometimes they are named individually. Sometimes they are spoken of collectively. In these collective moments, the word Anunnaki can appear, like a seal pressed into soft clay. Not a story, but an authorization. Uruk, by contrast, was a city of walls and myths. Its identity is braided with Inanna, and with kings who walk between the human and divine spheres. Here, divine drama is vivid. Descent, conquest, seduction, betrayal, grief. The gods are not only rulers, they are characters in motion. When the Anunnaki appear in such narratives, they can feel like a crowd in a great hall, an audience whose presence makes the stakes real. Yet even there, they arrive as if already known. The texts do not pause to explain their origin, because within the world of the poem, explanation is unnecessary. The poem assumes a shared horizon. Listeners already understand what kind of beings sit in the divine court. Eridu lies closer to the sea's ancient edge, the marshy threshold where land and water trade places. Its patron is Enki, associated with fresh waters beneath the earth, with craft, with plans whispered in hidden rooms. Eridu's myths often begin earlier than the human city, in waters and reeds, in a sense of firstness. When such myths speak of the gods, they often emphasize counsel and invention rather than decree. A council in this setting is not only a court, it is a workshop of decisions. If the Anunnaki appear here, they can be felt less as a fixed lineage and more as an atmosphere of authority around the speaking gods. These city theologies do not exist in sealed jars. They interact, compete, merge. Kings conquer and rebuild. Temples borrow hymns. Scribes train in one place and copy in another. Over time, a term that begins in one cultic sphere can travel into another, carrying traces of its earlier use, even as it adapts to new needs. The Anunnaki may be one such term, a name that belongs to a cluster of traditions rather than a single origin point. The central contradiction grows sharper here. Modern curiosity wants a creator because it imagines the Anunnaki as a defined group, almost like a people with a birth certificate. But the Mesopotamian record treats divine groupings as fluid. A divine council can be invoked with different names. A text might emphasize the great gods, the gods of heaven and earth, or the gods of the land. Sometimes the Anunnaki are present, sometimes they are absent, replaced by other collective words. The absence is not necessarily a secret, it can be a matter of genre. Administrative texts rarely need a mythic council. Hymns and myths do. Laments reach for cosmic witnesses, and so the council returns. What makes the gap feel uncanny is that the Anunnaki are often invoked at moments of decision. A god petitions, a decree is set, a fate is fixed. These are the moments where origins might be expected to matter, because authority begs for justification. Yet justification is usually not offered as a creation story. It is offered as seniority, as precedence, as belonging to the oldest order. In some compositions, Enlil's authority rests on his position after the separation of heaven and earth. In others, An's authority rests on his sheer height. A council's authority rests on being the council. It does not need a maker because it functions as the mechanism by which making is authorized. And still, the mind returns to the first appearance of the term itself. Where does Anunnaki first show up in the surviving record? Scholars cannot point to a single tablet and say, here, on this date, in this city, the Anunnaki are defined. The earliest occurrences are scattered, and even those depend on how fragments are dated. By paleography, by archaeological context when known, by comparison with other texts. Dating literary compositions is notoriously difficult. A tablet may be from one period but copy a much older work. A phrase may reflect an older tradition preserved by later hands. When the question is, who created the Anunnaki, the answer may be entangled with who first used the word, and even that is not securely knowable. In the quiet spaces of museums, scholars lean over tablets with angled light, tracing worn signs. They compare duplicates, a hymn to Enlil from Nippur, a parallel hymn from Ur, another from Sippar. Differences emerge. A line that names Anunnaki in one copy might use a different term in another. Is that a scribal error or a meaningful variation? Did one school prefer one word? Did the term become fashionable later? Or did it exist early and one copy preserves it while another does not? Each possibility is plausible. The corridor branches, then folds back. The cities themselves leave another kind of silence, the silence of what their temples chose to archive. Tablets in temple libraries and scribal schools often reflect what was considered worth copying. Myths about certain gods proliferate because those gods mattered politically and ritually. Other myths fade. A story about the origin of a divine council might not have been central to daily cult practice. It might have existed in oral tradition or in ceremonial performance without ever being fixed in clay. Or it may have been fixed, and the tablets simply did not survive. Later empires tried to gather and organize older traditions. The libraries associated with Assyrian kings, especially at Nineveh, collected texts from across Mesopotamia. That collecting preserved much. It also rearranged. Texts were copied into standardized forms. Local variations were smoothed or annotated. If the Anunnaki had an origin narrative in a local tradition, it might have been absorbed, shortened, or reframed when incorporated into broader compilations. The result would be familiar: a group present everywhere, origins nowhere. The investigation therefore turns toward a subtler question. Instead of asking who created them as beings, it asks who needed them as a category. What pressures, political, theological, ritual, made it useful to speak of a council called Anunnaki? In cities where kingship was contested, divine assemblies could mirror human assemblies. Where legitimacy needed reinforcement, a council could serve as witness. Where underworld rituals demanded solemn authority, the name could be attached to chthonic judges. Each use would add a layer until the term seemed ancient beyond memory. In the end, city-states do not provide a clean beginning. They provide a landscape of shifting emphasis, like maps redrawn after floods. The Anunnaki move across that landscape, sometimes near the bright temples, sometimes in the dark underworld, sometimes as a whispered collective. Their creator, if the term even allows one, may not be a single god or a single myth. It may be the slow accumulation of scribal choices, temple politics, and the human need to imagine authority as a gathering of silent, seated figures. But the corridor does not end here. If cities cannot supply a birth, perhaps the role can. The next step must follow the Anunnaki into the places they most often appear: courts, assemblies, scenes of judgment, where the air is still and decisions feel heavier than stone, and where a name can function like a seal that closes a door. The clay tablets rarely describe a divine council as a warm gathering. The atmosphere is formal, sometimes severe, sometimes eerily quiet. When the gods assemble, the language can carry the weight of procedure. A matter is brought forward, words are spoken, a fate is fixed. The Anunnaki, when named in these settings, feel less like personalities and more like the furniture of authority, seated presences whose agreement makes order real. This is where the term becomes most visible and also most enigmatic. A council can be invoked without needing to define itself. In human courts, the authority of judges rests on institution, tradition, continuity. The Mesopotamian divine council often works the same way. It does not explain why it exists. It performs, it pronounces, it confirms. The lack of origin becomes part of its power. It is older than questioning. In Sumerian literary compositions, especially those concerned with divine decrees, the Anunnaki can appear as the ones who determine destinies, or as a collective before whom a deity must stand. Yet translations vary, because the underlying lines are sometimes damaged and because the meaning of certain phrases depends on how signs are read. Some scholars render the group as the great gods, others as the Anunna. Others preserve the term and leave it to the reader's sense. The effect is consistent, an assembly beyond appeal. In Akkadian tradition, the idea of a divine assembly becomes even more explicitly political. Texts concerned with cosmic kingship portray decisions made in a hall of gods. The Anunnaki can be among those present or can be mentioned as those who receive or confirm authority. Yet here too, the record refuses to give a single stable roster. A council is not a membership list. It is a function. It can expand or contract depending on narrative need. What matters is that the decree is issued, not precisely who sits in the chairs. When myths require drama, the council becomes a stage for conflict. A god may complain of labor, of injustice, of imbalance. Another may propose a solution. The group reacts. Yet, even in these moments, the Anunnaki often remain a background chorus rather than individual voices. Their silence is meaningful. Silence can be consent. Silence can be fear. Silence can be the sound of an institution that speaks only through outcomes. That institutional feel has led some readers to imagine that the Anunnaki must have been deliberately invented, created as a divine bureaucracy to rationalize power. There is a plausible human logic in that thought. As city administration grew complex, temple economies, labor systems, royal decrees, mythic language could mirror social structure, but the sources do not allow a simple one-to-one mapping. The Anunnaki are not always administrators. They can be dread judges of the underworld, or ancestral gods, or a collective invoked in hymns. Their range is wider than a single sociological explanation. The underworld pulls the investigation into darker rooms. In Mesopotamian imagination, the land of the dead is not a place of moral reward. It is a house of dust, a realm of gates, a system of rules. When deities descend, they face procedures. In the well-known Sumerian narrative of Inanna's descent, the underworld's authority is embodied in Ereshkigal, and in the laws that govern entry and exit. The text speaks of judges and decrees, and in related traditions, the Anunnaki can be associated with this realm's officials. Yet the exact identification depends on textual variance and scholarly reconstruction. Some passages are clear, others are fragmentary. The picture forms like a face seen through rippling water. If the Anunnaki are underworld judges, then the question who created them changes shape. Underworld officials are not necessarily born in a mythic cradle. They can be appointed in the logic of the narrative world. They exist because the realm requires them. They appear when the story needs law. Their origin may be less important than their function, to keep the boundary between life and death intact. And yet, the underworld association also intensifies the sense of an erased beginning. Underworld material is often preserved in fragments, copied for ritual use, sometimes in the context of lamentation and incantation. These genres can be less standardized than grand epics. They can preserve older motifs in distorted forms. If the Anunnaki's earliest identity leaned toward chthonic judgment, that identity might be harder to trace, because it would sit in texts that survived unevenly. The corridors of modern archives echo this unevenness. Museum collections hold many tablets whose provenance is unclear, acquired through early excavations or antiquities markets, separated from their original archaeological context. Scholars can still read and publish them, but dating and localization become more uncertain. A text containing Anunnaki may be copied in one period, derived from an older composition, influenced by regional tradition, then deposited far from its origin. The term travels and the travel erases footprints. Scholars therefore look for anchor points, places where the Anunnaki appear alongside other fixed elements that can be dated or localized. They compare lexical lists that define divine names. They examine temple hymns with known cult contexts. They search for repetitions across sites that suggest shared traditions. But the result is rarely a single linear history. It is a web, and the web has gaps where threads should meet. The central contradiction remains. The Anunnaki are repeatedly invoked as if ancient, foundational, self-evident. Yet the surviving record does not preserve a clear myth of their creation. That does not prove there was none, but it does suggest that the ancient writers and singers did not prioritize telling it in the way a modern audience expects. Authority, in their world, could be self-justifying. The council exists because it exists. Still, there is a faint clue hidden inside the courtly setting. In human politics, institutions gain legitimacy by claiming antiquity. They point backward to an origin that is difficult to question. In myth, the same pattern can appear. An assembly's authority may be grounded in being the first, or the old ones, or the offspring of the sky. Yeah, if the Anunnaki are repeatedly invoked as primordial, then the question is pushed toward the older gods themselves, the genealogies that place An and others at the top of the cosmic order. The investigation must turn now to those genealogies, not as tidy family trees, but as competing blueprints of the cosmos. Somewhere in the shifting relations between An, Enlil, Enki, and the earliest divine forces, the Anunnaki may not be created at all, but crystallized, formed as a recognizable council when the cosmos itself was divided into domains. And if that division is the true beginning, then the next step lies in the most fragile place of all, the lines where heaven and earth separate, where names are first assigned, and where the tablets are most often broken. The oldest genealogies do not sit still. They are not a single tree planted in one soil, growing in one direction. They are more like reeds in a marsh, intertwined, bending, sometimes snapped and regrown. When modern readers look for the beginning of the Anunnaki, they often reach instinctively for family lines. Who begat whom? Which god is child of which? Yet, in Mesopotamian tradition, genealogy can be less about biology and more about precedence, domain, and the logic of authority. And, in many texts, stands at the top, but the nature of that top changes depending on the composition. Sometimes An is a distant sovereign, more title than personality. Sometimes he is active in council decisions. Sometimes he is invoked briefly, then disappears behind Enlil's commanding presence. Ki, as Earth, sometimes appears as counterpart, sometimes as a shadow, sometimes not at all. In certain traditions, the earliest moment is the separation of heaven and earth, a cosmic division that creates space for the world. The agents of that separation can vary. Some lines point toward Enlil as the divider. Others hint at older forces unnamed, or at actions that occur beyond the reach of narrative. If the Anunnaki are offspring of An, then their creation might be imagined as a natural result of An's generative authority. But this idea meets the silence again. The texts rarely linger on An producing a council. Instead, they present a world where multiple gods already exist, and where the main question is how they relate. Who commands? Who advises? Who tends to the deep? Who keeps the dead behind gates? The Anunnaki can be placed as a collective within that world, but the process by which they become a recognized collective is seldom narrated. The Underworld complicates the genealogy further. Mesopotamian texts often treat the Underworld as a domain with its own order, sometimes governed by Ereshkigal, sometimes associated with Nergal in later Akkadian tradition. The officials of that realm, judges, gatekeepers, attendants, can be represented as deities whose origins are not fully elaborated. Some are siblings or spouses in mythic episodes. Others appear only in lists and ritual texts. If the Anunnaki are underworld judges in certain traditions, then they may not be bound to the same genealogical logic as sky gods. They could be imagined as an ancient assembly that predates human cities, rooted in the very necessity of death. Some researchers suggest that the term Anunnaki may have shifted in meaning over time, becoming increasingly associated with the underworld in certain later contexts, while retaining broader assembly of gods meanings elsewhere. Others dispute the extent of such a shift, pointing to passages where the term does not carry an underworld connotation. The disagreement is not merely academic, it touches the heart of the mystery. If the meaning shifts, then the search for a single origin is chasing a moving target. The record's quietest corridor runs between Sumerian and Akkadian usage. Sumerian, as a written language, persists long after it is no longer spoken, maintained by scribal education. Akkadian, spoken widely, becomes the dominant language of empires and archives. Many compositions exist in both languages, or in bilingual forms, or in translations that are not exact mirrors. A term like Anunnaki may be preserved as a loanword, or translated into a descriptive phrase, or replaced by another collective name. Each choice affects how the group appears in the surviving record. A creation story might exist in one linguistic tradition and not in another, or it might be reframed when moved across language. When the genealogies are examined closely, a pattern emerges. The highest gods are often treated as given. They are not introduced with the careful beginnings of a chronicle. They are invoked like mountains, present, looming, part of the world's shape. In some myths, even the beginnings begin with already existing waters, already existing night, already existing mingling. Names rise out of that mingling, and the rise itself is sometimes the only creation the text is willing to show. If the Anunnaki belong to the divine order, their creation may be a matter of naming rather than making. There is also the possibility that the Anunnaki are not a separate species of gods at all, but an honorific grouping. In that view, the question who created them becomes similar to asking who created the elders in a city council. Elders are not manufactured. The category exists because time exists. It exists because people recognize rank. A divine elderhood could form in the same way, a collective label for those gods regarded as ancestral, weighty, close to primordial authority. Yet the sources tease another possibility. Some compositions treat decisions as decrees of fate, fixed by a gathering of great gods. Fate itself can be personified, but it can also be treated as an impersonal force that even gods must respect. If the Anunnaki are linked to the fixing of fates, then perhaps their origin is tied to the moment fate becomes speakable, when the cosmos stops being pure substance and becomes law. That would place their creation not in a birth scene, but in a transition from undifferentiated beginnings into ordered domains. This is where the image of maps that change becomes more than a motif. Mesopotamian cosmology is not a single map. It is a layered set of images: heaven above, earth in the middle, watery deep below, underworld beneath, and beyond these, a sense of primordial chaos or unformed water. Different texts emphasize different layers. The Anunnaki can be positioned differently depending on which map is being used. In a heavenly map, they can be the offspring of the sky. In a chthonic map, they can be judges below. In a political map, they can be the council that confers kingship. If the maps shift, then creation shifts with them. Modern scholars try to pin down these shifts by tracking the term across genres and periods, and by comparing how divine assemblies are described in different cities. But the effort runs into a familiar obstacle: broken tablets at precisely the places where cosmological transitions are described. The beginnings of myths are often damaged. The lines that set the scene, the older waters, the separation, the first naming, are the lines most likely to be lost, because they sit at tablet edges. A missing edge can remove the very moment where a term might have been explained. The investigation, therefore, must lean into the brokenness rather than avoiding it. It must follow the term into the textual strata where explanations might once have lived. School copies, fragmentary hymns, lexical lists, and the difficult world of variant readings. The Anunnaki may not have a single creation story because their identity is not anchored in one myth, or they may have had such a story, now scattered into pieces that no one has yet joined. In the hush between these possibilities, a more specific question begins to form, one that can be tested against clay. When do the Anunnaki appear alongside the earliest divine names in contexts that suggest primacy? An, Enlil, Enki, and the cosmic separation. If such passages exist, they might show whether the Anunnaki were conceived as born from An, appointed by decree, or simply assumed as the Old Council. The next corridor leads into scribal transmission itself, how texts were copied, adapted, and preserved, and how a name can gain the illusion of timelessness while its meanings quietly drift. A clay tablet is both fragile and stubborn. It can survive 3,000 years and still lose its first lines to a single careless touch. It can preserve a hymn almost intact, yet crumble at the point where the hymn begins to explain itself. This is the paradox that hangs over the Anunnaki. Their name repeats often enough to feel secure, but the pathways by which the name entered the written tradition are uneven, interrupted, and sometimes invisible. Most surviving literary tablets are not originals. They are copies made in scribal schools or temple scriptoria, sometimes centuries after the compositions they preserved were first shaped. Scribes learned by repetition. They copied standard text line by line. They wrote lexical lists that paired Sumerian words with Akkadian equivalents. They practiced signs until the wedges fell into place. In that setting, a word like Anunnaki could be transmitted not because its origin was understood, but because it belonged to a respected line that had to be memorized. This is where the feeling of a missing beginning becomes sharpest. A student does not need to know how a word was born to copy it correctly. A scribe does not need to solve theology to reproduce a hymn. The act of transmission can preserve a term long after its original context has faded. A name can move forward through time as a ritual necessity, while its earliest explanation dissolves behind it. The evidence for this comes in small, technical places. Lexical lists sometimes preserve groups of divine names and categories. They show that ancient scribes themselves cared about classification, about which gods belong together, about how to translate or gloss an older term. Yet those lists are not neutral windows. They reflect the intellectual world of the scribes who compiled them, which may be later than the earliest myths. If a list defines Anunnaki in a certain way, it tells something about later understanding, but it does not automatically reveal the earliest meaning. In literary texts, the problem deepens. Sumerian compositions were copied into the Old Babylonian period and beyond, often with subtle variations. A line that includes Anunnaki in one tablet might have a different collective term in another. Sometimes the difference looks like a simple substitution. Sometimes it changes the tone of a scene. A copyist might prefer a term that fits the meter, the expected vocabulary, or the theology of the school. Over long periods, such preferences can accumulate until they look like ancient truth. There is also the quiet pressure of standardization. Large centers of learning and power, particularly in later periods, collected and curated texts. In Assyria, royal libraries gathered tablets from many regions. Copies were made, cataloged, stored. This process preserved a vast body of material, but it also encouraged uniformity. When scribes created correct versions, they sometimes harmonized older differences. A divine council that had been described one way in one city might be described differently in a standardized copy. The Anunnaki could gain prominence in such a process, becoming the preferred label for an assembly that had once been named in several ways. The physical nature of tablets adds another layer to the illusion. Tablets were often written on both sides. The beginnings and endings, exposed on edges, are most vulnerable. When a tablet breaks, it often breaks the lines that set the scene. Those are precisely the lines that would define terms, introduce characters, establish cosmic context. The middle portions, where names like Anunnaki appear in action, can survive more often. The result is a record rich in usage and poor in introductions. Scholars try to compensate through reconstruction. They compare multiple exemplars of the same composition. They identify parallel passages. They propose restorations where broken lines can be reasonably filled. But restorations are always marked as such for a reason. They are proposals, not recovered certainties. Where the Anunnaki might have been explained, the restorations are often too speculative to satisfy the strictest standards. A modern reader might feel the temptation to fill the silence with confident stories. A cautious scholar resists because the clay does not fully permit it. This caution is sometimes mistaken for secrecy. Museums restrict handling because tablets are delicate. Some collections are not fully published because the labor of reading and joining fragments is immense. A fragment might sit unrecognized for decades because its signs are faint or because it belongs to a composition with no known parallels. These are not conspiracies. They are the slow realities of preservation, funding, expertise, and time. Yet the effect can feel the same as suppression, a corridor with doors that stay closed. The Anunnaki thrive in that atmosphere, not because they require concealment, but because they occupy a space where the record is naturally incomplete. The question who created them becomes a question about the nature of evidence. If the origin was ever written, it may be broken. If it was not written, it may have lived in performance, recited in temples, sung in rituals, shaped by local tradition, without being fixed in clay. Oral composition can be ancient and authoritative, yet it leaves fewer traces. When it is later written down, it can be written down already condensed, assuming shared knowledge that no longer survives. There are small hints that some compositions once offered more explicit cosmological framing. Certain hymns and myths open with lines that gesture toward first things, primeval time, separation, the establishment of divine domains. Where those openings survive, they can feel like the lip of an abyss, but where they are damaged, the abyss remains open. The Anunnaki often appear after this openings, as if stepping into a room once the furniture has been arranged. The arrangement itself is what is missing. The scribal world also complicates the meaning of created. Sumerian and Akkadian use different metaphors for origins. Gods can be born, brought forth, named, appointed, installed, raised to kingship. These verbs carry different implications. A group name like Anunnaki might be linked to one verb in one text and another in a different tradition. If the group is associated with being born from An, that suggests lineage. If it is associated with being installed in the underworld, that suggests appointment. If it is simply the gods in council, that suggests category. A single English word, created, flattens these differences, and the flattening itself can generate a false expectation of a single origin story. Yet the investigation does not retreat into abstraction. It follows the trail where it is strongest. Moments where scribes explicitly teach what a term means. Bilingual lists, explanatory commentaries, and god lists can act like lamps in a dark hall. They show how ancient scholars organize the divine world. If the Anunnaki appear there, grouped with certain deities, glossed in certain ways, the grouping may reveal how the concept had solidified by that time. But even these lamps cast long shadows. A god list can reflect theology in one period, not the earliest. A commentary can reflect an interpretive tradition, not an original myth. The Anunnaki may look more fixed in such sources precisely because they have already been stabilized by centuries of copying and ritual use. Stability, in that sense, can be a late achievement. The corridor therefore narrows toward a specific kind of evidence, lists that enumerate gods, especially those tied to the great cult centers. Lists are quiet documents. They do not tell stories, they arrange, they rank, they imply. And if the Anunnaki were ever created as a concept, it may be visible not in a dramatic mythic birth, but in the way scribes began to group certain gods together as a recognized body, an assembly that could be named without explanation. Somewhere among those lists, and among the commentaries that cling to them like faint marginal whispers, the Anunnaki may show a different face, not as a mysterious race from beyond the stars, but as a term that ancient scholars themselves struggle to pin down preserving older meanings while quietly redefining them. If that struggle can be traced, it may reveal the moment when the name began to harden into a council with an aura of primordial authority, an aura so strong that later readers would mistake it for a hidden origin. The next step waits in the most unassuming place: columns of names pressed into clay, where the gods stand in lines like silent officials, and where the order of the list may matter more than any myth. God lists are not the kind of artifacts that inspire easy romance. They are columns, they are sequences, they do not shimmer with narrative. And yet, in an investigation like this, they can feel like the most dangerous rooms in the archive, because lists reveal what a culture believed could be organized and what it believed could be ranked. In Mesopotamia, scribes produced many kinds of lists: lexical lists for language training, lists of professions, lists of objects, lists of divine names. The god lists matter here because they show how divine reality was sorted. A myth can contradict itself without embarrassment. A list is less forgiving. The list must decide who belongs where, which name sits beside which cluster is treated as a unit. It is classification pressed into clay. When the Anunnaki appear in these contexts, the term often feels less like a cast of characters and more like a label placed over a category of power. Some lists present groupings of major deities associated with specific cult centers. Others arrange gods according to genealogical logic or according to theological hierarchies. Scholars debate how these lists should be read, whether as local theology, as scholarly synthesis, as pedagogical tools, or as attempts at something like a universal order. Whatever their purpose, they demonstrate that ancient intellectuals were aware of variation and were trying, in some measure, to tame it. This is where the word Anunnaki can harden. In narrative, it can float. In a list, it can become an anchor point, a collective term that allows many individual names to be treated as a recognizable body. But the list does not tell how the body was formed. It simply treats it as already real. The effect is similar to walking into a city archive and finding a heading, Council of Elders, with names beneath it, but no founding charter. The council is assumed. The founding is absent. Some researchers emphasize that in Sumerian usage, Anuna may function as a collective for the higher gods, the great ones associated with authority and decision. Others note that in Akkadian contexts, Anunnaki sometimes appears in contrast to other divine groups, such as the Igigi, suggesting a conceptual division between sets of gods. But the division is not consistent across all texts, and the terms can be used in overlapping ways. The surviving evidence is enough to show that ancient people recognized groupings, but not enough to enforce a single, clean taxonomy across time. The presence of such shifting taxonomies is itself part of the mystery. If the Anunnaki were created as an idea, it may have been created not in a moment of mythic invention, but in a scholarly impulse. The desire to classify divine beings in a world where local traditions were many. As kingdoms expanded and empires formed, scribes encountered a wider range of cults and myths. Bringing those traditions into conversation could create pressure for umbrella terms. Anunnaki could be one such umbrella, a way to speak of the major gods without naming them all, a way to declare authority with one word. Yet even this explanation does not fully settle the unease, because it risks making the term seem purely bureaucratic. The Anunnaki do not live only in lists. They appear in hymns and laments, where their presence is invoked with emotion, fear, reverence, grief. A lament may call on the great gods to witness a city's devastation. Such laments, especially those connected to the destruction of Sumerian cities in the early 2nd millennium BCE, preserve a tone of catastrophe and ritual sorrow. In that atmosphere, collective divine names serve as witnesses and judges, not as classroom categories. The word becomes a door into a hall where the living address powers beyond appeal. If the Anunnaki function as witnesses, they also function as silence. A witness in a legal setting may not speak much. The fact of presence can be enough. In ritual speech, calling the Anunnaki can be a way to say, the highest order is watching. The term compresses hierarchy into a single invocation. That compression is not only scholarly, it is existential. It is a way of speaking to the immovable. And still, The question circles back. If the term is so powerful, why does the record not preserve a clear beginning? The list, the lament, the hymn, all assume. They do not explain. One possibility is that the explanation lay in a myth now lost, a myth that was once common knowledge and therefore did not need to be repeated. Another possibility is that there was no single explanation because the term did not begin as a name for a fixed set. It began as a descriptive phrase, the princely offspring, the great seed, the gods of An, and only gradually became a noun that could stand alone. In such a process, creation is not a scene. It is a slow grammatical shift, a turning of language into category. The evidence for such a shift is difficult to demonstrate definitively because it would require tracing the term across very early layers of writing, and those layers are thin. Early dynastic inscriptions are often concerned with kings, temples, offerings, warfare. They name gods, but they do not always elaborate divine counsels. The richest mythic narratives survive more abundantly in later copies. The more the record thickens, the more the term appears, but the more its origin recedes behind the density of tradition. There is also the problem of provenance and context. Many tablets were discovered in large numbers, sometimes in disturbed deposits. When fragments are separated from their original find spots, it becomes harder to know which texts were stored together, which were used in which rituals, which belonged to which school. A god list found in a scribal school might tell a different story than one found in a temple archive, even if the names overlap. Without context, a list becomes a floating artifact, and interpretation becomes cautious. Caution, however, is not emptiness. The pattern that emerges from lists and scholarly materials is that Mesopotamian religion contained a tension between multiplicity and unity. There were many gods, many local claims, many narratives. At the same time, there was a desire, especially in scholarly and imperial contexts, to align, to compare, to assemble a coherent cosmos. Collective terms like Anunnaki are part of that alignment. They allow local deities to be imagined within a larger divine polity. They allow myths of one city to converse with myths of another, even if the conversation is uneven. If so, then the question, who created the Anunnaki, becomes partly a question about who created the idea of a divine polity broad enough to need such a term. Not a single king, not a single priest, not a single scribe can be named with certainty. The process spans centuries and regions. It is a slow weaving, and the loom is language. Yet the investigation is not satisfied, because weaving still does not explain the persistent underworld association in certain texts. If Anunnaki can mean great gods in one setting and underworld judges in another, then classification alone cannot account for the drift. Drift suggests pressure from narrative and ritual. It suggests that certain scenes demanded a collective of dread authority, and that the name chosen for that collective carried an ancestral weight that fit the need. To follow that pressure, the trail must move from lists back into ritual practice. Incantations, funerary contexts, laments spoken for the dead, and the mythic geography of the underworld itself. There, the Anunnaki are not a scholarly heading. They are the ones who sit in a sealed space, behind gates that do not easily open, where names are spoken softly because loudness feels unsafe. The next corridor, then, descends. It leads away from the bright administrative world of lists and toward the darker rooms where the gods are invoked not to classify them, but to survive them. In Mesopotamian imagination, descent is never casual. To go down is to cross a boundary that does not like to be crossed. The underworld is described with images that repeat like a lullaby turned cold. Gates, bolts, dust, silence. A house from which those who enter do not return. The moral logic familiar to later traditions is not the center here. The underworld is a domain of order, but it is an order of containment. It exists to hold what must be held. When the Anunnaki appear in underworld contexts, the name takes on a different texture. It becomes heavier, less like a scholarly category and more like an ancient tribunal. In certain Sumerian and Akkadian compositions, divine figures in the underworld act as judges. They listen. They decide. They fix outcomes that cannot be appealed. Modern readers sometimes assume that such judges must have been created specifically for that role, as if an underworld bureaucracy required an inventor. But the texts do not show an inventor, they show a realm already governed by law. This is the repeating sensation, a realm with rules and officials, but no founding charter preserved. The underworld's laws are often treated as older than the gods who move through them. Even powerful deities must submit to procedure. In narratives of descent, a goddess or god can be stripped of symbols, made to bow, made to wait. The authority of the underworld is not portrayed as newly established. It is portrayed as primal. In such a frame, an underworld assembly called Anunnaki might not have been created in a single act. It might be imagined as coeval with the underworld itself, an aspect of cosmic necessity. Yet necessity is not a satisfying historical answer. The investigation wants to know how that necessity entered the written record, how a name became attached to it, and why the attachment is not consistent across all texts. The answer, if it exists, may be buried in the uneven survival of ritual and mythic compositions. Underworld-related texts often survive in fragments, and they survive in different genres: narrative myths, laments, incantations, prayers. These genres do not always preserve long explanatory passages. Incantations, especially, are functional. They name powers and demand outcomes. They can be terse. They can assume a shared mythology without stating it. If the Anunnaki were invoked in such contexts, the invocations would preserve the name, but not the story behind it. Fragments sharpen this effect. A broken tablet may preserve the middle of an incantation where Anunnaki are called upon, but the beginning that might have explained their role is lost. Scholars can sometimes identify the composition by parallels, but often the parallel itself is also fragmentary. Two broken beginnings do not make a whole. The result is a repeated, haunting glimpse. The Anunnaki named in the depths, with no surviving lines that say, why. There's also the tension between Sumerian and later Akkadian underworld imagery. Older Sumerian traditions emphasize the underworld as a fixed, bleak domain governed by Ereshkigal and by laws that regulate entry. Later, Akkadian literature introduces different emphases, including narratives involving Nergal and Ereshkigal, and different portrayals of divine assemblies. In such a shifting landscape, the Anunnaki could be pulled toward the underworld in some periods more strongly than in others. But to say this with confidence requires careful correlation of texts and dates, and the dating is often uncertain. A tablet's physical form can be dated, the composition it preserves can be older. The record therefore speaks in overlapping times. Some scholars suggest that the Anunnaki were originally a broad term for great gods and that their association with the underworld became more pronounced in certain later mythic contexts. Others argue that underworld connections are present early and that later portrayals only amplify an existing role. The disagreement persists because the evidence is not a single clear inscription, but a pattern assembled from many incomplete pieces. Patterns can be persuasive, yet they remain vulnerable to new finds and new readings. The underworld also offers a clue about why the origin question feels so compelling. In many myths, beginnings are narrated in the bright air: separation of heaven and earth, creation of humans, building of temples. The underworld is rarely given a beginning scene. It is presented as already there, like a shadow that has always been attached to the world. If the Anunnaki are linked to the underworld, then their origin may be hidden behind the same veil. The veil is not intentional concealment. It is a narrative habit. The dead realm does not require origin, because its existence is treated as inevitable. This inevitability can feel like an erased record. The modern mind expects a story for everything, a source for each authority. But Mesopotamian texts often treat certain structures, fate, death, underworld law, as part of the cosmic furniture. The Anunnaki, when tied to these structures, inherit their silence. They become uncreated in the narrative sense, not because they are beyond inquiry, but because the texts were not built to satisfy that inquiry. Yet there is an additional complication, one that pulls the investigation toward the modern world of artifacts and access. Many underworld-related tablets, like other Mesopotamian pieces, reach museums through complex histories of excavation and collecting. Some were excavated in controlled contexts, others surfaced through antiquities markets. Provenance affects interpretation. A tablet from a known temple archive can be situated within a cultic setting. A tablet of unknown origin cannot. When provenance is unclear, the temptation grows to treat the term Anunnaki as universally stable, because context cannot constrain it. The lack of constraint can inflate mystery. Museums and scholarly institutions respond with caution. Tablets are fragile. Access can be limited by conservation needs. Publication can be slow. This caution can feel like a sealed corridor to outsiders, but it is also a necessary protection. The result, however, is that certain texts remain less accessible to broad audiences and the gaps in public understanding widen. In those widened gaps, speculative narratives flourish. They promise a creator because they promise closure. But the investigation remains restrained, listening for what the clay can actually support. The clay supports this much. The Anunnaki appear in contexts of judgment and authority, sometimes linked to the underworld. The clay does not support a single explicit myth of their creation as a group. It does not provide a founding moment. It provides functions, roles, invocations, and a shifting sense of where the group belongs. To move forward, the inquiry must return to the places where beginnings are most likely to be narrated, the cosmological epics and myths that speak of primeval time. If the underworld does not have a beginning scene, perhaps the cosmos does. Perhaps the Anunnaki are named at the moment the gods divide labor, divide realms, or establish kingship among themselves. In such moments, a council can be made, not by crafting bodies, but by creating hierarchy, by naming who sits and who serves. The next corridor therefore turns upward again, away from dust and bolts and gates, toward the louder arena of cosmic conflict and divine politics. There, the record may not answer who created the Anunnaki, but it may reveal when the idea of a divine inner circle became necessary enough to be named. In the great imperial libraries of Mesopotamia, silence took on a different form. It became storage. It became shelves and baskets, clay tablets stacked like compacted seasons. The library associated with the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh is often invoked as a place where the ancient world attempted to gather itself. Thousands of tablets were collected there, myths, rituals, omens, scholarly treatises, copied and organized by trained hands. The fragments discovered in the 19th century, scattered through ruined rooms, changed modern knowledge of Mesopotamian literature. Yet the library is also a monument to incompleteness. Many tablets were already old when they were copied for the Assyrian court. Many arrived damaged. Many were copied from exemplars that no longer survive. The rooms collapsed. The tablets broke. The modern recovery was partial. The library preserves abundance, but abundance can conceal gaps. A missing opening line in a key cosmological text can remain missing even when the rest is present. For the Anunnaki, the library matters because later Akkadian literature includes the term in context of divine assembly and cosmic order. The best-known examples are not secret, but they are also not straightforward. In the Babylonian creation epic, the gods emerge from primeval waters, conflict erupts, kingship is established, and order is proclaimed. Within this drama, groups of gods appear as audiences, supporters, and witnesses. The Anunnaki can be mentioned among these groups, but their presence does not answer the origin question cleanly. The epic is not a genealogy of every divine group. It is an argument for a particular cosmic kingship tied to Babylon's patron god in its standard form. Its energy is political and theological, not archival. Even where the epic seems to approach the question, it slips away. The earliest generations of gods arise from mingling substances, and the narrative rushes toward conflict. The council becomes a mechanism of legitimation. Who has the right to rule? Who can bear the tablet of destinies? Who can decree? When the Anunnaki appear in such a setting, they can look like an institutional chorus, affirming a winner. Their existence is assumed. Their creation is not narrated. This pattern repeats in other compositions. Divine politics is common in Mesopotamian myth. Authority is negotiated, contested, granted, transferred. Councils meet. Decisions are declared. But the council itself is rarely given a birth scene. The Anunnaki function like the court in a kingdom. The court may be formed by history, but the story being told focuses on the king. The library's other texts deepen the feeling of a missing beginning because they show how much ancient scholars cared about origins in some domains. Omen series trace patterns across the sky and the body. Ritual texts specify sequences with precision. Scholarly treatises classify signs, words, gods. The intellectual atmosphere is rigorous. And yet, for a group like the Anunnaki, explicit origin remains elusive. The absence feels less like ignorance and more like a deliberate genre boundary. Origins of cosmic substances are narrated. Origins of institutional groupings are assumed. Some modern readers interpret this as evidence that the Anunnaki must come from an even older stratum, perhaps predating written myth. That is possible in a limited sense. Oral traditions can be older than their written attestations, but it does not follow that the group was created by a hidden agent or by a lost civilization. The more restrained possibility is that the concept of a divine council was so fundamental to Mesopotamian religious life that it did not require a founding narrative. Councils existed in city governance. Councils existed in temple administration. Councils existed as a way to imagine distributed authority among gods. The divine council may have been felt as a natural extension of social reality, and natural extensions are not always given origin myths. Still, the library's brokenness suggests another possibility. The missing explanation may have existed in commentary traditions now only partly preserved. Mesopotamian scholars did write commentaries on earlier texts. They explained obscure words, resolved contradictions, aligned names. Such commentaries survive unevenly. Where they exist, they can be fragmentary, difficult, and technical. They can also reveal that ancient scholars themselves noticed gaps and attempted to bridge them. If a commentary ever discussed the Anunnaki's meaning or origin, it might sit in a fragile corner of the corpus, published in specialized editions, known to experts, still incomplete. The corridor becomes restricted not by secrecy, but by difficulty. The physical history of the Nineveh tablets adds to the sense of restricted corridors. After excavation, fragments were dispersed into collections. Scholars spent decades joining pieces, identifying compositions, and publishing editions. Even now, joins can be made when a fragment in one collection matches a fragment in another. Every join has the potential to restore a missing line, and a missing line can change interpretation. This is why the question remains alive. The record is not finished. The clay is finite, but the reading is ongoing. For the Anunnaki, the possibility of new joins matters because an origin, if it ever existed in writing, would likely have been stated in an opening section or transitional passage, exactly the kind of portion most often lost. A fragment with the right lines could shift the entire inquiry. But until such a fragment is securely identified and read, the responsible stance is to hold uncertainty. The library also introduces a subtle temptation to treat later standardized texts as if they were the original face of Mesopotamian religion. The Assyrian court collected and curated. Babylonian theology shaped certain compositions. When modern readers encounter the Anunnaki in these contexts, they may assume a fixed empire-wide meaning. But earlier local Sumerian usage can differ. The group may have been less fixed, more contextual, before scholarly and imperial standardization. The result is a familiar illusion. The later archive looks like an eternal canon, and what is missing in that canon feels like a deliberate omission. Yet the ancient world did not leave a single canon. It left an ocean of clay, and oceans have currents. The Anunnaki are carried by those currents. Their name appears in places where authority is being asserted. Their role can change with the needs of a text. Their meaning can drift with language. The library preserves them, but it also preserves the drift. At this point, the investigation finds itself facing the title question with renewed sharpness. If the Anunnaki are not given a creation scene because they are an institutional category, then asking who created them may require shifting the frame, not looking for a maker god, but looking for the historical processes that made such a category necessary and stable. That points toward political unification, scribal synthesis, and the rise of imperial ideologies that needed a coherent pantheon. But that frame is still incomplete because it risks erasing the older, more intimate contexts where the term may have first mattered. Local rituals, city laments, temple hymns. The next step must therefore move between the library and the city, between the standardized epic and the local prayer. It must examine the creation epics not as answers to the origin of the Anunnaki, but as evidence of how divine authority was imagined, and how a council's presence became a tool for declaring that imagination legitimate. In the quiet after the library's collapse, the question remains like a tablet half buried in dust. The next corridor leads toward the epics more closely, toward the places where divine labor is divided and kingship is granted, moments when a council's existence becomes necessary enough to be invoked, and where a group like the Anunnaki might be made in the only way institutions are made, by being treated as real until no one remembers when they were not. Creation in Mesopotamian literature often looks less like a craftsman shaping clay and more like an argument being settled. The cosmos is not built in calm. It is negotiated, contested, divided. Waters mingle, names emerge, generations of gods clash. When order finally appears, it is frequently declared rather than constructed, as if speech itself is a tool heavier than stone. In that kind of world, a divine council is not an accessory. It is the mechanism by which declarations become binding. A lone god might be powerful, but a council makes power lawful. This is why, in texts that modern readers describe as creation epics, the most decisive moments often involve assemblies, gods gathering, debating, consenting, ratifying. The Anunnaki, when they appear in these moments, are not presented as an invention of the narrative. They are presented as a prerequisite for legitimacy. The Babylonian creation epic provides a clear example of how this works, even if it does not answer the title question directly. The narrative's early scenes take place before the world's familiar boundaries. Primeval waters are personified. Younger gods disturb the old equilibrium. Conflict escalates until a champion rises. That champion's authority is not merely a matter of victory. It must be affirmed. The gods gather. They offer names, titles, and tokens of rule. They grant the right to decree. The epic is deeply concerned with kingship among the gods, who holds it, how it is conferred, and what it allows. In such scenes, groups of gods are invoked to represent the collective will. Depending on translation and interpretation, the Anunnaki can be among those groups. Their presence functions like a council chamber filled with witnesses. The text does not pause to say where they came from, because their role is to serve as the weight of consensus. If the narrative were to explain their creation, it would be explaining the creation of its own legal framework, and the epic is not built to do that. The framework is assumed because the epic needs it to work. This is not unique. Other Mesopotamian compositions treat divine assemblies in similar ways. Gods meet to decide fates. They assign domains. They grant or withdraw kingship. Sometimes these decisions are portrayed as ancient precedents that human kings imitate. The council becomes a cosmic model for politics. A temple is not only a building, it is a mirror of divine order. A king is not only a man, he is a vessel of decree. In such mirrors, the council must always already exist. Here, the investigation encounters a subtle shift in the meaning of created. A council may be created when the cosmos is structured such that councils are necessary. In a world of undifferentiated waters, there is no courtroom. In a world of divided domains, sky, earth, underworld, deep, there are boundaries to manage, disputes to settle, duties to assign. The council becomes the solution to complexity. Its creation is therefore entangled with the creation of complexity itself. This frame begins to explain why the Anunnaki appear more readily in periods and texts where cosmic and political complexity is emphasized. As Mesopotamian societies grew and changed, city-states forming alliances, competing, being absorbed into larger kingdoms, their religious language could increasingly favor images of councils and decrees. A divine group name that signals the authoritative assembly becomes useful. The Anunnaki may have gained rhetorical power in such contexts, not because they were newly invented, but because they were the perfect term for the kind of authority being claimed. Yet, this still leaves the persistent question of why the term specifically points toward An, the sky god. If the Anunnaki are simply the council, why anchor them linguistically to An? One possibility is that anchoring to An is itself a strategy of antiquity. An is often treated as primordial. To be of An is to be close to the first authority. In politics, legitimacy is strengthened by claiming descent from an ancient throne. In myth, legitimacy is strengthened by claiming proximity to primordial sky. But the textual record does not always treat An as the active ruler. In many compositions, Enlil holds the practical authority of command, while An remains remote. This makes the anchoring more interesting. A council of An can function as a ceremonial seal even when another god executes decisions. It suggests that beneath the visible politics of the pantheon lies an older, higher sanction. In this sense, the Anunnaki can be invoked as a bridge between the remote primordial and the active present. They carry the aura of An into the council chamber. Some scholars suggest that the relationship between An, Enlil, and the assembly reflects shifts in theological emphasis over time and across regions. Nippur's Enlil-centered theology, for example, could coexist with older or broader ideas of An's primacy. The council might therefore be described as of An, while functioning under Enlil's authority, reflecting a layered compromise. And as ultimate source, Enlil as executive power, assembly as validating body. Such compromises rarely produce clean origin stories. They produce terms that carry multiple functions at once. The creation epics also reveal another quiet truth. In many of them, humans are introduced as a solution to divine labor. The gods demand relief. A plan is devised. Humans are made to work, to maintain temples, to keep offerings flowing. The details vary across texts and are debated in scholarship, but the motif is persistent. Divine order requires maintenance, and maintenance requires labor. This motif has often been seized upon by modern speculative interpretations, but within the texts themselves, it functions as a theological explanation for human obligation, not as a record of historical events. Still, the presence of this motif matters for the Anunnaki question because it shows how councils operate as problem-solving bodies. A council hears complaint, devises plan, declares outcome. If the Anunnaki are part of that council, their identity is bound to adjudication, not to origin. They are created, if at all, by the narrative need for adjudicators. Yet even here, something remains unsatisfied. The Anunnaki are not only invoked in creation contexts, they appear in laments, in underworld scenes, in hymns of praise. Their name carries a dread weight that exceeds mere bureaucracy. It suggests more than a committee. It suggests ancestral depth. That depth cannot be explained by epic politics alone. The investigation therefore begins to suspect that the Anunnaki's mystery is a product of overlap. Overlapping maps of cosmos, overlapping layers of tradition, overlapping meanings of a term across Sumerian and Akkadian worlds. In one layer, they are the great gods of the assembly. In another, they are underworld judges. In another, they are an honorific category tied to An's primacy. These layers can coexist without being reconciled, because different genres do not demand reconciliation. But for a modern reader seeking a single creator, the layers feel like a gap where an answer should be. To narrow that gap, the next step must focus on translation debates themselves, the moments where scholars disagree about what a line means, what a sign should be read as, whether a group name is present or implied. The Anunnaki may be less mysterious than they appear, or more complex than any single definition allows. Either way, the corridor ahead is lined with fragile decisions: the placement of a bracket, the reading of a damaged sign, the choice to translate or transliterate. In those small decisions, a council can be born, altered, or erased. A single wedge can change a universe. In the study of cuneiform, certainty is often built from small, repeated agreements. A sign read the same way across texts, a phrase appearing in parallel passages, a grammatical pattern that holds. But when a tablet is damaged or a sign is ambiguous, interpretation becomes a narrow bridge over darkness. Scholars mark uncertainties with brackets and dots, and the marks themselves become part of the story. The Anunnaki sit in those marks more often than many would expect. One source of debate is deceptively simple. When a text refers to the gods, does it mean a specific named group or a general collective? In some Sumerian compositions, a phrase can be translated as the Anuna, or the Anunnaki, or simply the gods, depending on the underlying signs and on scholarly judgment. Sometimes the term appears clearly, sometimes it is inferred, sometimes the tablet is broken right where the determinative or phonetic complement would settle the question. In such cases, translations can diverge without anyone acting in bad faith. The clay does not fully arbitrate. Another debate concerns the relation between Sumerian terms and their Akkadian renderings. A Sumerian group name can be carried into Akkadian as a loanword, or it can be replaced by a descriptive phrase. When Akkadian scribes translate or adapt older Sumerian material, they sometimes choose terms that fit Akkadian theology and poetic style. The Anunnaki can therefore appear more prominent in one language tradition than another, not because the concept is absent, but because the translator's choices shift emphasis. Later readers who rely primarily on one corpus may see a different pantheon than those who work across both. The Underworld association adds further complexity. In certain Akkadian texts, Anunnaki can be used in contexts clearly connected to the netherworld. In others, the term appears in heavenly or political contexts. Scholars debate whether this reflects a stable division, Anunnaki below, Igigi above, or whether such a division is a later schematic interpretation imposed on a more fluid reality. The evidence supports that both patterns exist in different places, but the temptation to turn pattern into rule is strong. When a rule is asserted too confidently, it can generate a false expectation of an origin story. If the Anunnaki are underworld gods, then surely they must have been created when the underworld bureaucracy was established. But the texts do not clearly describe such an establishment. There are also debates about the meaning of Anuna versus Anunnaki. Some treatments regard them as essentially the same term with variations in form. Others point to contexts where the forms might have different nuances. The distinction can hinge on scribal orthography, period, and regional preference. The record is not uniform, and uniformity is often a modern desire rather than an ancient reality. These debates are not merely technical. They shape the emotional contour of the mystery. When a modern reader encounters Anunnaki as a fixed, capitalized entity, it feels like a proper noun with a biography. When a scholar translates the same line as the gods, the proper noun dissolves into a generality. The creator question then loses its target. Was there a specific group that needed a creator, or a flexible phrase that later hardened into a group name? The answer changes depending on how the term is handled across the corpus. The debates extend to genre. In hymns, collective divine names can function as rhetorical amplifiers, calling on all the great gods to magnify praise or to intensify lament. In such contexts, naming the Anunnaki may be less about precise theology and more about invoking maximum authority. In incantations, naming can be functional and formulaic, designed to cover every possible power that might interfere. A term like Anunnaki in an incantation might be present as a catch-all. In epics, the term might serve a political function representing the assembled divine will. Each genre uses the term differently. If so, there may never have been a single origin in the narrative sense. The term may have been adopted because it was useful across genres, and usefulness can spread a word faster than theology can define it. Scholars also debate the extent to which later, Mesopotamian scholarship attempted to systematize older material. Commentaries and lists show that ancient intellectuals were aware of variation and tried to align it. The Anunnaki could be part of that alignment. If an ancient scholar decided that a certain group of gods should be called Anunnaki in a canonical arrangement, that decision would influence later copying. Over time, what began as one school's preference could become the dominant form. This would create the impression that the term had always been fixed, even if earlier usage was more fluid. In this way, translation debates become a mirror of the larger mystery. The question who created the Anunnaki might be answered partly by who stabilized the term. Stabilization is a kind of creation. It creates a concept by making it repeatable. It creates a name by making it appear in contexts where it once might not have been used. It creates a council by making it the default translation for the great gods. Yet, stabilization is distributed. It is not the work of one named person. It is the work of generations of scribes and scholars, ancient and modern, each trying to make sense of inherited material. Modern scholarship, of course, is cautious about attributing ancient developments to single causes. There is no single ancient author whose intentions can be cleanly recovered. Most Mesopotamian literary compositions are anonymous. They belong to traditions rather than to individuals. The record includes colophons and scribal notes in some cases, but these usually identify the copyist, not the original composer. This anonymity intensifies the feeling of a missing creator. If a modern audience wants a name, a maker, a founder, the ancient record offers few. Here, the investigation touches the boundary where historical inquiry meets the psychology of expectation. The desire for a creator is a desire for anchoring, but ancient Mesopotamian religious language often anchors authority not in a single inventor, but in timelessness, in repeated ritual, in institutional continuity. A council is authoritative precisely because it is imagined as older than memory. Still, it would be too easy to stop here and declare the mystery solved by fluidity. The Anunnaki continue to resist reduction. Their name is not merely a generic phrase. It carries a specific resonance across traditions. It is tied to An. It is invoked in moments of fate and judgment. It appears often enough to suggest an enduring concept. The question becomes, what enduring need did the concept serve, and when did that need become visible? To approach that, the investigation must step into ritual context more carefully, not as vague background, but as specific kinds of texts where the Anunnaki are invoked. Ritual and incantation literature is where ancient people negotiated with unseen powers most directly. In those negotiations, group names can be used with precision. They can also be used as comprehensive nets. If the Anunnaki were invoked as a net, that may show how they were imagined, not as a story to be told, but as a force to be addressed. The next corridor, therefore, turns toward the practical and the intimate. The spells and prayers, the laments and rites, the moments when the living ask the divine world for protection, for justice, for relief. There, the Anunnaki may appear not as an academic puzzle, but as a presence felt close enough to fear. Ritual texts do not explain themselves. They are written to be used. They assume a world where unseen forces press against daily life, where sickness can be a sign, where misfortune can be a message, where the boundary between human and divine is negotiated through words spoken in precise sequences. In this world, names are tools. To name a power is to reach it. To name a group is to summon an entire hierarchy at once. When the Anunnaki appear in ritual and incantation contexts, they often carry the weight of comprehensive authority. Sometimes they are invoked alongside other collective terms, as if the speaker is casting a wide net across the divine world. Sometimes they are invoked in connection with judgment, fate, or the underworld, where decisions feel irreversible. The language can be formulaic, but the formula is not empty. It is a method for surviving uncertainty. In certain Mesopotamian incantation traditions, the goal is to expel a harmful influence, an illness demon, a curse, a restless dead spirit, by calling upon higher divine authority. The higher the authority invoked, the harder it is for the harmful force to resist. In such a hierarchy, a collective term like Anunnaki can function as a summit. It signals not one god's intervention, but the sanction of the highest order. Even if the speaker cannot name every deity individually, the collective name implies them. It compresses a pantheon into a single utterance. This compression may explain why origin stories are not foregrounded in ritual. In ritual speech, what matters is efficacy. A healer does not need to recite the founding myth of a court to demand its authority. The court's authority is assumed by the community that performs the rite. If the Anunnaki are invoked as guarantors of fate, then the question of who created them is irrelevant to the ritual's purpose. Their origin is submerged beneath their function. Yet, the Anunnaki's presence in ritual also suggests that the term was more than scholarly. It was not limited to school tablets and libraries. It belonged to the language of coping. That belonging can be traced in the ways ritual texts frame divine order, by naming major gods, by naming collective councils, by naming underworld authorities, by naming cosmic forces. The Anunnaki appear as part of that web. Here, however, another silence becomes audible, the silence of genre preservation. Many ritual texts survive in later copies, particularly from 1st millennium BCE contexts in Assyria and Babylonia, when scholarly and ritual traditions were highly developed. Earlier ritual texts exist, but the corpus is uneven. If the Anunnaki appear frequently in later ritual material, that may reflect the term's stabilization in later periods rather than its earliest usage. The question then becomes, did ritual practice help stabilize the term, or did a stabilized term enter ritual practice? The direction of influence is difficult to prove. Ritual literature also shows how easily group identities can be shaped by the needs of invocation. If a text aims to cover heaven and earth, it may name different groups to ensure completeness. Some traditions contrast heavenly gods and underworld gods. In such a contrast, the Anunnaki can be positioned below while another group is positioned above. Yet in other contexts, the same term may be used broadly for the great gods without underworld emphasis. The variation suggests that ritual usage can reinforce a particular mapping of the pantheon, but different rituals can use different maps. These maps are not only theological, they are experiential. Night rituals, funerary rites, and laments lean toward underworld imagery because they deal with loss. Temple festivals and hymns of kingship lean toward heavenly assemblies because they deal with power and legitimacy. The Anunnaki move with these emotional currents. They become judges in grief, witnesses in political ceremony, guarantors in healing rites. One of the most haunting places to feel this is in lamentation tradition. City laments, composed in response to destruction, whether by war, famine, or political collapse, speak with a voice that tries to make sense of ruin by placing it inside divine decision. The gods are addressed as the ones who allowed, decreed, or failed to prevent catastrophe. A collective assembly may be invoked as the body that fixed a city's fate. In such laments, naming the Anunnaki can be a way of saying the highest order knew. The lament does not always accuse. It often mourns the distance between human suffering and divine decree. The logic of these laments can feel like an erased chapter because it treats fate as if it were written elsewhere, in a divine archive inaccessible to humans. The gods have a council. The council decides. Humans witness only the outcome. The Anunnaki, in this view, become the custodians of the inaccessible file. To ask who created them is to ask who created the archive that contains fate. But ritual texts do not provide an answer. They deepen the mystery by showing how the Anunnaki functioned. As a collective invoked when individual gods were not enough, when the speaker needed the weight of the whole. That function suggests that, historically, the term became useful when Mesopotamian religious language needed a way to invoke top-tier authority without exhaustive enumeration. That need could arise naturally in the large, complex pantheons. Still, usefulness does not fully explain why the term persisted and why it carried such a specific resonance. Many collective terms could have served. The persistence suggests tradition. an inherited phrase repeated until it became ritual muscle memory. In that repetition, the phrase gains an aura of antiquity. It begins to feel older than the rituals that use it. In time, it becomes part of the architecture of the sacred. And architecture brings the investigation toward another sealed space, the temple itself. Temples were not only houses of gods, but also centers of archives, where texts were stored, copied, and used. The movement of tablets through temple corridors, the copying of older hymns, the ritual use of standardized phrases, all of this shaped the divine names that reached modern readers. If the Anunnaki's origins are missing, it may be because temples did not preserve origin narratives with the same urgency they preserved functioning rites. Or it may be because the origin narrative, if it existed, belonged to a different kind of performance, one that left fewer durable traces. The next corridor, therefore, turns toward the institutional realities that shape preservation. Why certain texts survive, why others do not, why access to some materials remains limited, and how mundane constraints can produce the sensation of a deliberate gap. In those constraints, the Anunnaki's mystery can be amplified, without anyone intending it, until the absence begins to look like a locked door. A gap in the record can be born from ordinary reasons and still feel extraordinary. Clay survives by chance, excavations recover by circumstance, museums conserve by necessity, scholarship advances by time and money and the slow availability of trained eyes. None of this is dramatic. And yet, when a question presses on an absence, when it asks for the first moment a name should appear, ordinary limits can begin to look like sealed doors. The Anunnaki sit at the center of such a perception because the word has become famous far beyond the specialist world. Modern books, films, and online discussions often treat the Anunnaki as a single coherent entity with a single origin, sometimes folding them into expansive speculative narratives. Many of these narratives build on selective readings of ancient material, on modern reinterpretations, and on the understandable human desire for a clean beginning. In that atmosphere, the lack of a clear origin text does not read as an expected feature of fragmentary ancient evidence. It reads as a provocation. A restrained investigation cannot deny that popular reinterpretations exist, or that they shape expectations. But it must separate what the tablets say from what later imagination adds. The tablets, as published by scholars in editions and translations, present the Anunnaki as a term used in multiple contexts: divine assemblies, underworld judgments, ritual invocations, cosmic politics. What they do not provide, at least in the commonly discussed corpus, is a single explicit narrative that states, here is the moment the Anunnaki were made. Here is their maker. Here is the reason they exist. The absence is real. The temptation is to fill it. Some modern reinterpretations treat the absence as evidence of suppression, yet there are gentler explanations that fit the known realities of the field. Many tablets are unpublished or only partially published, not because of hidden agendas, but because reading cuneiform is specialized labor, and collections are vast. Even published texts often exist in multiple copies, some better preserved than others, and new joins can change readings. Access restrictions often protect fragile artifacts. A tablet cannot be handled endlessly without damage. Institutions sometimes limit access to conserve, to prevent loss, to comply with legal and ethical standards regarding provenance. Such limitations can create the impression of restricted corridors, but corridors can be restricted for reasons that have nothing to do with secrets. There is also the question of context. A tablet's meaning is not only in its lines, but in its place, where it was found, what it sat beside, whether it belonged to a temple archive, a palace library, a scribal school. In early collecting history, many tablets were removed from context and provenance was poorly recorded. This loss is irreversible. Without context, certain questions become harder, especially questions about origins. A term like Anunnaki might have carried different nuances in different local archives. Those nuances blur when the archive is scattered. Academic caution can also look like concealment to outsiders. Specialists mark uncertainty openly. broken lines, disputed signs, alternative translations. This caution is not weakness, it is a discipline. But to a public trained on definitive narratives, caution can feel evasive. When a scholar says, the reading is uncertain, or the term may mean X in this context, the listener may hear a refusal to commit. In the space between caution and desire, speculation grows. Speculation also grows because the Anunnaki question touches a deeper human pattern, the urge to ask who created the creators. In many mythologies, gods have origins, but the highest powers often hover beyond origin stories. They are treated as primordial, as the condition of possibility. Mesopotamian tradition frequently frames its highest structures, fate, death, cosmic order, as older than the dramas that unfold within them. If the Anunnaki belong to those structures, their missing origin may not be an accident. It may reflect how ancient writers understood authority, as something that does not require an inventor because it is part of the world's frame. Yet, even if this is true, it does not eliminate the historical question. Words enter use at some point, group names form, concepts stabilize. The Anunnaki may not have been created as beings in a single mythic scene, but the term was created in language, and language is a human artifact. That creation could have happened through repeated ritual usage, through scribal classification, through the political need to speak of a divine inner circle. It could also have been influenced by shifts in theology as cities rose and fell, as empires gathered local traditions into broader systems. Modern debate sometimes tries to pin this down with timelines. Early Sumerian usage, later Akkadian expansion, first millennium ritual standardization. Such timelines are helpful, but they remain tentative because of the copying problem. A tablet's date is not always the composition's date. A Sumerian hymn copied in the Old Babylonian period may preserve an earlier tradition, but it may also contain later adjustments. A term like Anunnaki could appear in a copy because a later scribe used familiar vocabulary, even if an earlier version used a different phrase. This makes first use nearly impossible to assert with absolute confidence. This impossibility is itself a kind of sealed space. Not a locked door, but a door that opens into a room where the floor is collapsed. The investigator can look in. The investigator can describe what is visible. But stepping across requires guessing where the missing boards once lay. Responsible scholarship refuses to pretend the boards are still there. In this setting, the modern question, who created the Anunnaki, begins to look like an echo of a different question. Why does the record feel as if it should contain an answer? The feeling comes from the Anunnaki's weight in later reception. The name sounds like an origin should exist because the name is treated as if it refers to a fixed kind of being. But in the ancient evidence, the name behaves more like a title for authority, a category invoked where decisions are made. Titles do not always have birth stories. They have histories of use. And still, the investigation does not want to soften into mere sociology. The Anunnaki's tie to An keeps pulling upward. If the term encodes descent from the sky god, then even as a title it gestures toward primacy. It suggests an older sanction behind later assemblies. That sanction could be theological, not literal. It could be a way of saying, the council speaks with sky-born authority. But if that is the case, then the true creator might be an idea rather than a deity. The idea that ultimate authority must be rooted in the highest, oldest realm. Ideas leave traces. They leave traces in how texts describe decrees, in how they arrange gods, in how they speak of destiny, in how they imagine a tablet of destinies or a divine decree that fixes the world. The Anunnaki, in many contexts, cluster around those traces. They appear where fate is set, where judgment is rendered, where a boundary is enforced. So the corridor narrows again toward the oldest and most abstract thing in the record, the concept of destiny itself, the authority to decree, the power to write reality into being. If the Anunnaki are bound to that authority, then the question of their creator may not be answered by finding a lost myth about their birth. It may be answered by understanding when Mesopotamian culture began to imagine decree as a cosmic technology, a power that needed an assembly to wield it. The next step, therefore, moves toward the deepest motif behind their name: the tablets of fate, the decrees of the gods, and the unsettling possibility that what feels like a missing origin is really a sign that the Anunnaki were never meant to be explained, only invoked, like a law whose authorship is hidden behind the law's own voice. In Mesopotamian thought, words can bind, decrees can harden into reality, a fate can be fixed, a city's destiny decreed, a kingship granted. These are not metaphors in the casual sense. They are ways of describing how authority works at the highest level. The divine world is not only powerful, it is administrative in the cosmic sense. It issues decisions that the world must obey. The more closely the record is read, the more it becomes clear that the Anunnaki hover near this zone of binding speech. They are invoked, where destinies are determined and where judgment cannot be escaped. This does not prove that they are the sole holders of fate. Different texts distribute that power among different gods. In some compositions, Enlil is the great decreer. In others, An's authority is foundational. In others, councils collectively determine outcomes. The distribution shifts like light through reed curtains, yet the recurring image is the same. A council exists because decree requires more than a single voice. It requires a chorus that makes the decree unquestionable. This is where the title's contradiction feels most intense. If the Anunnaki are a body tied to the authority of decree, then asking who created them is like asking who created the law itself. The law is present because the cosmos is present. The law does not narrate its own origin. It speaks as if it has always had the right to speak. The Anunnaki, as an institutional presence, inherit that same self-justifying tone. One of the most evocative objects in this conceptual world is the idea of a tablet of destinies, a token of authority that grants the right to decree. The motif appears in various forms across Mesopotamian literature. It is not always the same object in every text, and interpretations vary, but the core suggestion is consistent. Authority can be carried, seized, bestowed. It is not merely personal strength. It is the right to right reality. When authority can be carried, it can also be contested. Myths of divine conflict often revolve around who holds the power to decree. This brings the divine council into sharper focus. If decree is contested, then legitimacy matters. Legitimacy is often granted by collective recognition. The Anunnaki, when invoked as a collective, can represent that recognition. They do not need an origin story because their role is to be the legitimizing body. But even a legitimizing body must have a reason to exist in the imagination. That reason may lie in the human experience of institutions. Mesopotamian city life was structured by councils, assemblies, temple administrations, and royal courts. Decisions were formal, records were kept, seals were pressed. If human authority required procedure, divine authority could be imagined the same way. A council of gods becomes the cosmic reflection of the city's governing logic. In that reflection, the Anunnaki are not created as beings. They are created as a necessity of a certain worldview, a worldview that understands power as something that must be ratified. This is a gentle answer, but it does not eliminate the unsettling residue, because if the Anunnaki are an institutional necessity, then their creator is not a god. Their creator is the human need to imagine the universe as lawful, and that need, in turn, may be created by fear of chaos, flood, famine, invasion, disease, death. When the world feels unstable, a lawful cosmos is a kind of shelter. A council that fixes fate is terrifying, but it is also comforting. Terrifying because it can decree ruin. Comforting because ruin is not random. The same council can, in theory, decree restoration. This duality is present in the record's tone. Laments appeal to divine assemblies as witnesses and judges. Hymns praise gods who uphold order. Incantations invoke councils to overpower harm. In each genre, the Anunnaki's authority is both threat and refuge. A being who can decree fate is not a gentle companion. It is a force that must be approached with careful words. The modern sensation of restricted corridors returns here in a subtler form. Not the restriction of museum access, but the restriction built into the concept itself. Fate is a corridor humans cannot fully enter. The gods meet beyond hearing. Decisions are issued from sealed halls. The record often speaks as if certain knowledge is inaccessible by design. Humans can know the outcomes, the rituals, the obligations, but not the full deliberations of the divine. The Anunnaki, as an assembly, are placed on the far side of that restriction. They become the guardians of the inaccessible room. If so, the absence of an origin story becomes almost expected. An origin story would humanize them. It would bring them closer. It would make them narratable. But the role they serve, ultimate authority, benefits from distance. Distance creates awe. Distance discourages argument. A council without a founding scene feels older than memory. It feels like a law of nature. That feeling is part of its power. Yet, even in this interpretation, the investigation must remain careful. It cannot claim that ancient writers consciously withheld an origin story to create awe. Intentions are difficult to infer. The more defensible claim is that the genres and functions of Mesopotamian texts do not consistently prioritize such origins, and that the surviving corpus is fragmentary. Together, genre and fragment create a silence that modern readers experience as a missing chapter. The question, then, has traveled far from its initial form. Who created the Anunnaki? No longer points toward a hidden artisan god. It points toward a convergence, language, ritual practice, political imagination, and the human need for lawful structure. The Anunnaki, in this view, are created where these forces overlap, where a culture imagines the highest authority as a council bound to the sky's primacy and the underworld's judgment. And yet, the investigation must resist giving even this as a final explanation. The evidence does not force a single conclusion. It suggests patterns. It offers plausible frames. But the Anunnaki remain multivalent, shifting between heaven and underworld, between list and lament, between political epic and ritual formula. The creator question may be unanswerable in the way it is asked, not because the past is deliberately hiding, but because the term itself is a doorway built into a house that was never designed with a blueprint preserved. There's only one corridor left before the last. It is the corridor of meaning itself, the symbolic, philosophical layer where a culture's language about gods becomes a mirror for human longing and fear. The Anunnaki are not only a philological problem, they are a shape in the darkness that people have used to think about authority, fate, and the silence behind events. In that darkness, the question becomes less about origin and more about what is done with the absence. A missing beginning can become a space for fantasy, for doctrine, for dread, for comfort. The Anunnaki have become such a space in modern imagination. And if the record cannot close the gap, then the final step must not pretend to close it. It must instead sit with the gap, like a lamp in a long corridor, until the absence itself begins to speak in the only language it has, the quiet pressure of unanswered things. The last corridor is the hardest to walk, because it leads not to a new tablet, not to a newly joined fragment, not to a clever translation, but to a kind of stillness. The question has been carried through cities and temples, through scribal schools and royal libraries, through underworld gates and cosmic councils. At each turn, the record has offered forms of the Anunnaki, assembly, judges, great gods, offspring of sky, while withholding the one thing the modern mind most wants, a single beginning that can be pointed to and named. The temptation, at the end, is to force an ending anyway, to select the most satisfying frame and call it truth, to claim that the Anunnaki were created by this god, or that king, or that school, or that lost epic. But the clay resists. The clay does not consent to closure. It answers only as much as it can bear. A restrained view can say this: in the surviving Mesopotamian literature, divine groups often appear already established. Their authority is assumed. Their origins, when given, are often expressed as cosmic precedents rather than as a crafted event. A word like Anunnaki can function as a collective title, invoked where authority must feel absolute. It can drift in meaning across centuries, taking on underworld weight in some contexts and broader assembly weight in others. The desire for a single creator is, in part, a desire for a modern kind of narrative clarity that these sources do not consistently provide. And yet, even that statement is only a hand on the doorframe. It does not explain why the absence feels like an injury, why it feels like something has been erased. That feeling comes from the way the name itself behaves. It does not sound like a generic phrase. It sounds like a proper noun that should have a story. It sounds like a group whose first moment should be somewhere, written down, preserved, readable. Perhaps the feeling of erasure is not only about the Anunnaki, perhaps it is about the nature of the ancient record. Mesopotamia gave writing to the world in forms that survive as fragments. Clay broken and scattered, stored and rediscovered, read and reread. Writing creates the illusion that everything can be known because it can be stored. But the stored world is still vulnerable to fire and flood, to war and abandonment, to the simple softness of time. The first line is often the first to go. The beginning is always at the edge. In such a world, the question, who created the Anunnaki, becomes a lens through which the fragility of knowledge is seen. It is not only a question about ancient gods. It is a question about how human memory is built and how easily it can be chipped away. A divine council becomes a metaphor for the way authority accumulates without leaving a receipt. A missing origin becomes a metaphor for the way the past can be thick with detail and still thin where meaning is most desired. There is another layer, quieter still. In many Mesopotamian texts, the world is governed by decrees that humans cannot hear being made. The gods decide in sealed spaces. The living feel the outcome. The Anunnaki, as a name for the assembled authority, are part of this architecture. They stand for the sense that events are not random, even when they are devastating. They stand for a universe where the corridors of causation run behind walls. Modern imagination often reacts to that architecture in two ways. It either rejects it and demands a different kind of agency, or it exaggerates it into total hidden control. Both reactions are understandable. Both are attempts to deal with the discomfort of not knowing. The ancient texts themselves sit somewhere in the middle. They acknowledge human limitation, they provide rituals and hymns as ways to negotiate, and they leave vast spaces of silence untouched. If the Anunnaki have a creator in any defensible sense, it may be the human habit of turning silence into form. A gap in the record becomes a doorway. A doorway becomes a figure standing in it. A figure becomes a council. A council becomes the name that can be spoken when no other name is enough. The Anunnaki, then, are created and recreated each time the term is used to hold together a world that feels larger than the mind. This does not mean the ancient people invented them casually. It means that the surviving record shows them functioning as a necessity of ritual, of politics, of cosmic logic. The necessity itself is created by living in a world where fate feels real, where rivers flood, where crops fail, where cities fall, where loved ones descend into dust. In such a world, the idea of an assembly that fixes destinies can be terrifying, but it can also be a way to endure. Terror is not always a flaw in belief. Sometimes it is part of the belief's honesty. And so, the investigation ends where it began, not with an answer, but with a shape of absence. The Anunnaki stand at the edge of what can be stated from the tablets. Their name carries the sky and the underworld in the same breath. It carries the authority of councils and the dread of judgment. It carries the impression of antiquity so deep that the mind expects to find a beginning and cannot accept that the beginning is missing. In the long night of history, some doors remain closed, not because a hand is holding them shut, but because the hinges have rusted away and the frame has collapsed. A doorway can remain, cut into darkness, even when the room beyond has been lost. The Anunnaki may be such a doorway, a threshold into the oldest Mesopotamian attempts to speak of power, fate, and the unseen assemblies behind events. And in that threshold, the most enduring mystery is not who made the council, but why the human mind keeps returning to councils at all, why it seeks a chamber where decisions are made, even when the chamber is silent. Perhaps it is because silence is never empty. Perhaps it is because the absence of a beginning forces a person to listen more carefully to what remains. In the end, the clay offers no final name, no final maker, no bright inscription that resolves the question. It offers instead a kind of humility, the knowledge that the past is a house with many rooms, and that some rooms have been swallowed by time. The Anunnaki wait at one of those thresholds, neither confirmed as a single fixed entity nor dissolved into nothing, but suspended in the quiet tension between what is written and what is missing, like stars reflected in a river at night, steady enough to guide, and yet always moving with the water.